Psychoanalysis is a school of thought that was founded by Freud, but Freud is certainly not the only famous psychoanalyst. Freud had a very influential circle of friends in Vienna. They were all great thinkers and intellectuals, and many of them became psychoanalysts just like Freud. As a matter of fact, the Vienna Circle, as they came to be known, was eventually devoted entirely to the study of psychoanalysis. Several of the people on the list you're looking at right now were members of the Vienna Circle. Some came later and are people that are known as neo-Freudians. Most of the original Vienna Circle members were close personal friends of Freud, but apparently Freud was quite dogmatic in his thinking about psychoanalysis, and he thought of it as his baby, and it was his way or the highway. So as soon as any of these other great thinkers would start to develop their own ideas about psychoanalysis or challenge some of Freud's thoughts, they were essentially drummed out of the Vienna Circle, and most of them never spoke to Freud again after leaving the Vienna Circle. I can't talk about all of these influential people in this course, but I will focus on two of them, Carl Jung and Alfred Adler, not just because they were among the most influential of the group, but they're also the two that are discussed in your textbook. Carl Jung was Swiss, and he was a close personal friend of Freud's. He was one of the original members of the Vienna Circle. However, he completely lost his relationship with Freud when he began to disagree with some of Freud's ideas, and they ended up not being on friendly terms at all after that. His theory of the personality in many ways is very similar to Freud's, but he introduced some new terminology and some new concepts, which I'll get to in a moment. But one of the major ways in which he disagreed with Freud is that he didn't think that sex was the most important source of energy. For Freud, sex was really what it was all about. Jung thought that sex was still important, but it wasn't the only thing. Jung's theory is still very much a psychodynamic theory. In other words, he thought that who we are and how we behave is very much an outcome of the conflict between opposing forces in the personality struggling with each other. Because for psychoanalysts, without conflict, there is no energy, there is no motivation. Some of the other ways in which his theory differed from Freud's. He introduced the distinction between the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. Now, his idea of the personal unconscious was very similar to Freud's notion of the unconscious, but he introduced the idea of the collective unconscious. He believed that we shared a certain consciousness with all other human beings because we share the same brain structure, we have the same common evolutionary history, and there are certain instincts and themes and images that throughout the history of our species have been important. And those sort of come down to us and help shape our personalities. And he talked about some of the things we find that are coming from our collective unconscious that are part of ourselves. For example, he talked about the persona. This is the mask that we present to other people as a way of hiding our true selves. He also discussed the shadow, which is our dark side, an inherited tendency to be immoral and aggressive. He talked about the animus and the anima. These are the masculine and feminine predispositions in the personality. And for Jung, the goal of life is to attain a harmonious blending of all these different aspects of the personality, but at the same time allowing each one of them to be expressed and recognized. He called this process individuation. He developed an influential theory of psychological types, which is important even today. Many of you may have taken the Myers-Briggs type indicator. This test used to be called the 16 personality factor test. It's completely traceable back to Jungian theory, and it remains one of the major tools that people use today to help you decide what kind of career you want to pursue. Another thing that Jung really pioneered was advanced techniques for the interpretation of dreams. For Jung, the interpretation of dreams was probably even more important than it was for Freud, and he thought that dreams were a way of finding out which aspects of the personality were not being expressed. If you go to any bookstore and go to the psychology section, you'll see many books on the shelves about Carl Jung, and more specifically, you'll see a lot of books about the interpretation of dreams based on Jungian psychology. Alfred Adler was a Jewish psychoanalyst who was the third of 7 children and the son of a grain merchant. He too was one of Freud's original Vienna circle, and he also split with Freud eventually and became his enemy because he dared to challenge some of Freud's ideas. Adler called his system of psychology individual psychology because he stressed the uniqueness of each personality. And the understanding of a personality is only possible, according to Adler, if we are aware of the individual's goals and his or her attitudes toward life. Because for Adler, the goals of people are what direct their behavior. And one of our primary goals is that we're always striving and struggling toward perfection or completion. We want to be perfect people. And this is often generated by feelings of inferiority. Adler's notion of inferiority was probably very much influenced by his own childhood. Let's face it, when you come into the world as a child, you're the smallest, dumbest person around. Everybody is more experienced, and so you naturally feel sort of inferior. And in Adler's case, he always thought that he was sickly and small and ugly, so he always felt inferior, and he thought that this made him strive for superiority. Now, this can be healthy. We can become a dominant person who uses our newfound feelings of confidence to help other people, or it can become kind of pathological, where we kind of dominate other people and we're aggressive. But feelings of inferiority are something that are very motivating for people and very troubling and cause a lot of anxiety. And the feeling of inferiority that each individual has can come from different sources. Adler talked about something called organ inferiority, where you think that there's some part of your body that is somehow defective, and you strive to overcome that. So perhaps if you feel you have unusually small hands and you're self-conscious about that, you may overcome that by becoming an outstanding pianist. And by playing the piano masterfully, you show that your hands are every bit as good as anyone else. He talked about masculine protest. This is exaggerated strivings caused by feelings of unmanliness, because in Adler's world, superiority is equated with masculinity and usually expressed by assertiveness, independence, and dominance. In women, this can be expressed by trying to compete with men and beating them at their own game, or by becoming super feminine and luring them in and dominating them. So if you're not very successful at overcoming these feelings of inferiority, you suffer from what's called an inferiority complex. So whenever you hear the term inferiority complex being thrown around, we're talking about Adler. Now, he had several other different important contributions. He introduced the idea of social interest, which is an innate interest in the well-being of other people, and it relates to being good with people. You're considerate, you're community-oriented, and it's the goal of proper personality development. And style of life is the way that you get there. It's a way of developing strong social interest. Now, like most psychoanalysts, Adler believed that things that happen in early childhood were absolutely essential to the development of a healthy personality. And for Adler, the parents play an absolutely crucial role in children's choice of a lifestyle and their ability to develop social interest. And so when things go wrong, as they often do, for Adler, you can always blame the parents, because ultimately it's bad parenting that leads to bad personalities. You had to worry about pampering your children. Because this robs them of independence and initiative, it shatters their self-confidence, and they grow up feeling that the world owes them a living. This can lead to an intense inferiority complex. But you can also go to the other extreme and be a neglectful parent. And this creates the impression in children that the world is totally cold and unsympathetic, and people grow up suspicious and isolated and stubborn and sort of aggressive. So you've got to walk a very fine line if you're a parent. And he also thought that the birth order in a family was a very important part of developing your personality. Think about the oldest child. You come into the family and you're the only one there. So let's say for 2 years you have your parents' undivided attention. And then it happens. Another baby is born, and suddenly the attention and the resources are divided between you and someone else. And you never quite get past this, according to Adler. And so the firstborns grow up feeling like a dethroned king, resentful and hostile. They understand that power and authority matter, and they know what it's like to have lost it. And they grow up very supportive of authorities and become politically conservative and resist change because change has been bad for them. Now, later born children come into a world where other children are already there. They're used to competition. They like to see power change hands, and they tend to be more ambitious. They're used to having older rivals, and they also, if you're the youngest especially, run the greatest risk of being pampered. There is some interesting modern research that in some ways supports Adler's view about the importance of birth order and personality. The goal of Adlerian psychotherapy is to promote a socially interested style of life and to help people overcome their feelings of inferiority.